guys, welcome back to another vlog. This one is number 8 and we're back at Commerce to see if we can continue our win streak. This one ended up being a longer session than the ones prior, and there were quite a few hands we were involved in, so much so that we actually ran out of battery mid-session and needed to recharge the camera. Before we begin, I want to thank everyone who's already subscribed to this channel, as it's really been that motivation factor to continue making these vlogs. I work in the tech field, and even with that perceived edge, making these vlogs can be very time consuming, from content narration to planning and gluing everything together for that optimized and polished delivery. I'd like to see if we can hit the 1K subscriber mark by the end of this year, and your help in getting the word out there about this vlog, whether it's to your friends or associates or what have you, would be very much appreciated. And for those who are new to this channel, just sit back and enjoy the content. It's meant to be a short diversion from life stressors. This session is recorded in a very similar structure to episode 6, and we'll be covering a few different stakes today. We start off by playing the 5-5 game while waiting for a 5-10 seat to open up, and wrapping up by heading back to the 5-5 games. You might be asking why I limped in hand number 1 with a suited ace on the button, and hand number 2 is somewhat of an indication of what the reason is. There are a bunch of weak type players at this table, and some adjustments are needed to get them in hands. I haven't quite figured out exactly what the right adjustments are yet, but it's a work in progress. Commerce had this crazy announcer on the PA system calling off 5 names at a time for the waitlist in rapid fashion, though this person was nowhere to be found. The floor that's usually at the podium directing traffic was also missing in action. I had my name called and then quickly removed on 2 separate occasions before I found the floor wandering around being a chip runner. He apologized for the confusion and said that they were short-staffed due to the pandemic. I was placed back on top of the list and eventually got into the 5-10 game after a small wait. Shortly after sitting down, we found ace-jack under the gun and opt to raise to 35 not knowing the table dynamics yet. I end up getting called by the hijack and cutoff positions, which seems promising. The flop is queen-jack 10 with 2 spades, which is the best flop I could hope for aside from flopping Broadway, and I continue for 85 here. Both the hijack and cutoff decide to fold. In retrospect, I probably could have let out smaller, maybe 55 to elicit callers, but in this situation I don't think that would have changed much. It became apparent after a few orbits that these 2 players were playing strictly fit or fold. In this next hand I have ace-king on the button, and as this hand was being played out, I was thinking about getting a table change as there were way too many granders at this table. But instead, I decided to stick around and change my game to trying to run the table over. There were quite a few deeper stack players, and I felt like this might be something we could possibly do. What was I just saying? Oh, that's right, running over the table? Yeah, maybe after this hand. The flop was fairly coordinated and favors the small blind's range much more than mine. The small blind checks and I follow suit. The 10 of clubs on the turn pretty much freezes the action. The river is the 6 of clubs. Action checks to me once more, and while I do hold the ace of clubs, I don't think it makes a lot of sense to bet here given the action so far, so we check and get shown ace 10 offsuit for the winner. This next hand is an interesting one for sure. I look down and find ace-jack in mid position and open to 35. The button and big blind call. The flop is 6-6-7, and when the big blind checks to me, I continue for $55. The button calls, and the big blind calls as well. The turn is a king, and when the big blind checks again, I bet 125. The button folds, and the big blind calls once again. When the river is a 10, while 8-9 does get there, the big blind is never checking here with a straight. So when it is checked to me, 2 things cross my mind. 1, the big blind is probably getting sticky with a 7. And 2, I'm thinking this is a good board texture to go 3 streets with repping a king. So I size up to 310 here. And the big blind decides to snap me off with 7-10 offsuit. I'm not exactly thrilled with the results, but I do think this is a credible line to take. It's been a struggle to get any momentum for the game tonight. I've been whiffing pretty hard, while I've seen others hit some home runs out of the park. In this next hand I have pocket 8s in mid position and raise to 35. The cutoff, button, and big blind call. The flop is jack 4-2 rainbow, and when the big blind checks to me, I think about betting here, though my image is pretty poor after just showing down a 3-barrel bluff in a prior hand, so I decide to check. The cutoff and button check as well. The turn brings to queen, and the big blind open folds. I check, and the cutoff now bets 85, and ends up winning the pot. Sometimes, when you try to run the table over, what ends up happening is the table runs over you instead, which is exactly what happens in this next hand. We're involved with our nemesis from hand number 5, and we've concluded he's a bit of a call station and can show up with all sorts of stuff as long as he has the tiniest chance to win. I've been wanting to get into any hands possible with this guy before he goes busto. In this hand, we have under the gun limp, and our nemesis on the button raises to 45. I look down at ace-queen in the big blind and raise to 155. The early position player folds and the button calls. The flop is jack-4-jack, and I bet 120 here on the flop, and the button calls pretty quickly. The turn is a 2 of hearts, and now I decide to ship it in here for 485 total, and he pretty quickly calls. As the dealer collects the pot, I'm wondering what on earth this guy is calling with. The river is a 3 of hearts, and I flip over my hand expecting to be good here some percentage of the time against this player. Unfortunately, this is not one of those times when he flips over the king-queen of hearts. Yuck. I'm not overly too surprised, but I'm also bummed that this guy has my number tonight. If we break down this hand, he's just getting the right odds if I always have a pocket pair under the jacks. If I ever have ace-king or ace-queen, or even a jack here, it's a negative value proposition for him. I plugged in this exact scenario to see how the math comes out, and here's what it looks like. On the turn, the button had about 27% equity in the hand with his exact holdings and needed roughly 31.5% to make this call break even. If I had a pocket pair, his equity rises to 32%, and the times that I have a jack here, his equity drops to 18%. I'd like to hear if you like the way I played this hand or how you would have played it differently. Leave a comment below with what you would have done, and if you were in my shoes on the turn, would you have gone all in or lived to fight another day? Meanwhile, my new friend is here to gamble, and I'm still looking for a perfect spot to exact some revenge. I reload for 1500, and about 10 minutes later we run into hand number 8. We find ourselves in another opportunity to tangle with our nemesis at the table. The low jack raises to 30, and the high jack and cutoff call. I look down at ace-king on the button, and it's time to thin the field a little here. I raise to 145, and an initial raiser folds. After some contemplation, our nemesis in the high jack calls, while the cutoff hightails it out of there. The flop is queen 7-3 with 2 clubs. And when it checks over to me, this is a clear continuation bet of 115. Our opponent thinks for a while, but ends up calling. I'm going to 3-barrel this with ace high again against this guy if I have to. Fortunately for us, we don't have to 3-barrel bluff this time around, as the turn couldn't be any better being the ace of spades. This time I fire for 315, and he actually calls pretty quickly here. While I'm feeling a lot better about my hand now, there are 2 flush draws on the turn, and there may be a lack of clarity on the river. The river is pretty gin as it does not complete any flush draws and actually gives us top 2 pair here. While it does complete a straight for Jack 10, he almost never has Jack 10 here except for maybe Jack 10 of clubs. Either way, I'm not stepping off the gas here, and when he checks it over to me, I have an interesting decision to make. I can either go big for his remaining 1,000, or I can put in a smallish value bet to get a crying call from a larger portion of his holdings. At this point, I don't know what he has, and while I can think of a few hand combinations that could possibly pay off a pot-sized bet on the river, it would absolutely suck to let this guy off the hook. So I opt for the smaller value bet of 455, to which he calls pretty quickly. Nuts. I guess that means I missed some value here. I flip over ace-king and he rolls his eyes, shakes his head, and it's good. We finally get a partial refund. I think I have a new nemesis who's targeting me specifically at the table. He's wearing a Hulu tech hat, and it takes me a hand or two to figure out his playstyle and what he's up to. In this first hand, there are 2 limpers to me, and I find king-queen in the hijack, and I raise to 60. Mr. Hulu in the small blind raises to 210, and I give this one up. About an orbit goes by, and I find ace-queen on the button, and I raise to 45 with 1 limper. Mr. Hulu is at it again, and he raises to 160 from the blinds. After reviewing this hand, I think I would have preferred a 4-bet sizing to around 450 here. He's clearly some guy who's taken some training course who's taught him how to 3-bet out of the blinds, but there are some weird leaks in his strategy. As played, we fold here, but we have a solution for Mr. Hulu coming up in the very next hand. In this final hand that we'll be covering, we get ace-queen again in the offsuit variant while in the low jack, and raised at 45 due to the dead money from a post. And Mr. Hulu, don't you know, he's on the button, and he decides to call after some contemplation. Based on what I've seen, this is mostly pocket pairs like 8s through 10s, and middling suited connectors in 1-gappers like 9-8, 8-7, etc. Something like that, or at least that was my assessment at the moment. Heads up, we see a flop of Jack 7-4 rainbow. I continue for 85, and he pretty quickly calls. The turn is a deuce, which helps no one on this board at all. I continue for 175, and Mr. Hulu now says that's not enough and raises to 375, which is effectively a min-raise. His bet is constructed to do two things. It's designed to make me fold air balls, or 2, it's designed to slow me down so I check the river and he can get to a showdown cheaper. Given the action so far, I eventually decide it's the latter. And you know what, Mr. Hulu? I'm just not having any of that today. I'll see you on the river, and we're going to play for stacks. I raise to 875 leveraging stack diffs for max pressure. He thinks for a bit and eventually decides on a fold. Good news. Today was definitely a case of choppy waters. The silver lining is that the numbers were positive, even though we weren't able to keep our sustained level of run good. We were in for 30-40 and cashed out for 33-77. Thanks again for joining me for another poker vlog. You guys are the reason I make these videos, and I'm glad some of you actually stick around to check out the outro. One of these days I'll up my outro game as well, maybe one day soon. For more up-to-date posts and any questions pertaining to this channel, poker, or just to say hi, you can follow me on Instagram at OnLifeTilt. Take care of yourselves, stay safe, and see you next time.